Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. Really happy to have Jesse Driscoll here today. Jesse got his degree here in political science. Great to have him back. He's now a professor of political science at San Diego in the Global Policy and Strategy School. I already forgot what you said it's called, but it's GPS. He is an expert on many things, but region-wise, Central Asia and post-Soviet space. He's written three books. His first book, which was based on his dissertation, Warlords and Coalition Politics in Post-Soviet States, which was based on really remarkable fieldwork he did in Tajikistan and Georgia. He then wrote a book on doing field work in hard to do field work in places called Doing Global Field Work. And what he'll be talking to us today about his latest book with Dominique Arel, Ukraine's Unnamed War Before the Russian Invasion of 2022. So thanks for coming, Jesse. Look forward to your talk. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. It's very good to be back at CSAC. Better than I can say. First thing to amplify from Jim's comment is that mine is just one of two names on this book. The other, Dominique Arel, is the Danny Liu Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Ottawa. And Dominique has devoted his life to the case. He took responsibility for making sure that our empirics were bulletproof because he knew that he would take some fire from his community. Second, it's important to note that I'm not a spokesperson for the US government, the Department of Defense, the Joint Staff, anyone else. I'm just an academic and I have no authority over anything. I did work as a Ukraine desk officer in the plans division of the Joint Staff in 2022, but the book was completed before I walked into that building, before I signed a giant stack of non-disclosure agreements, before the nature of the war changed. And as such, this is not a talk on the current war. There's not going to be anything in this presentation about FPV drones or glide bombs falling on Kharkiv or anything like that. This is on recent history and on the war before the war, you might say. So the title makes reference to the fact that during the period that we're describing in this book, which is commercially available and you can read, neither side's diplomats wanted to call this a civil war. They wanted to call it a war. Ukraine wanted to call it aggression, and Russia wanted to call it a civil war. So this talk is going to answer the question why. What did the language of civil war, what did that terminology do instrumentally for the Russian bargaining position prior to the large-scale invasion of 2022? So if you are puzzled about why the language of civil war specifically was so radioactive and why so few Ukrainians want a negotiated settlement despite the enormous costs of this war, and you want to think about what kinds of domestic constraints an elected Ukrainian peacemaker is someday going to face, stick around. This is a war of narratives, and so deliberate and careful interpretation is necessary. And I'm going to go into some depth on that. I'm going to use in these opening phrases some work from Lena Hansen, who is a post-structuralist scholar whose work is useful because it lets us draw a picture of the Russian narrative stripped down to its bare essentials. I'm going to leave this up for a while. The hard arrows are processes of linking. The dotted arrows represent radical difference. And an oppositional split subject is just drawing a critical distinction. So Dominique and I are empiricists, and we employ game theory, which puts an emphasis on strategic interactions and the importance of sequencing. And I gave a talk about that in the department earlier today. But Lena's point is different. Lena makes a set of, I think, correct observations that sometimes we're all used by the words we use, whether we understand it or not. And I think it's good to have post-structuralists in the conversation to remind us of that. There is a reason in an environment that is so saturated by disinformation, when you're pretty sure that your opponent, your adversary, whatever you want to call it, your competitor, is capable of just making up facts to suit their position, to stay away from certain keywords that you know are triggering things that are the wrong things to be triggered. And civil war can definitely be one of those keywords. So that's a reason why we in the West today call it an aggression or invasion. And Russians like to still use the words special military operation, responsibility to protect, and they make reference to the period that we're writing about in their diplomacy as a civil war. And they argue with what oftentimes seems to be sincerity that what they did in Ukraine in 2014 is analogous in every relevant way to the US use of military power in Kosovo or in Libya. Helping defenseless people, they would say. And the difference is that they're our people instead of what you Americans do, which is pretend to be interested in civilian populations in order to knock off governments that you don't like very much. That's how they would put it. It's a powerful argument. It's a legitimization device that the current regime in Russia is completely dug in on, which means that the current regime, anyway, will probably never be able to back down from the claim, which is false, that their people, quote unquote, were under threat when Russia first acted in 2014. So the reason that we spend so much time in our book paying attention to sequencing is because we care so much about invalidating that claim. Russians want other things to be true too, of course. Putin, if you listen to him talk to Tucker Carlson, clearly wants a lot of things to be true. But for our purposes today, it's important to emphasize that they really need for the claim to be true that their people were under threat. So we go in our book to great lengths to interrogate that claim as even-handedly as we could, using primarily Ukrainian sources. This is a fairly thankless task, I have to say. It's much easier to just dismiss the entire claim as disinformation without shouldering the burden of actually getting into the details of the weeds of how and why it is disinformation. So I've left this up so you could look at it. Though this picture does look complicated to us, those few wrinkles of complication are necessary for the Russian narrative to smooth out some cognitive dissonance. So this is a narrative that allows Russian diplomatic talking heads to say, the Ukrainian people are the real victims here. The Ukrainian leadership is at fault for this whole war. When we kill Ukrainians, we're not even killing real Ukrainians, quote unquote, we're killing fascists. We're not even fighting Ukrainians. We're actually fighting the West, and that's coincidentally taking place on the territory of Ukraine. And this war won't end until the great powers in the West understand that we're a great power too, and this is a family matter, and they need to stay off our lawn. Okay. I'm not endorsing any of that. I'm just stating it factually as a summary of the Russian position. A final point, and I borrowed this from Mike Kaufman, who I think deserves credit for amplifying it. With these beliefs, it was also possible to imagine a very quick and nearly costless occupation where the Ukrainian people are so grateful to rejoin the family that there's no occupation cost. So they had plans, we know, to clip a few Ukrainian leaders and have some show trials, basically keep Ukrainian institutions intact, have some parades in Kiev, like a kind of a ceremonial arrival in the form of that Thunder Run air corridor from Hostomel. And if you have these beliefs, it actually becomes a Russian government that's very difficult to deter with the threat of porcupining Ukraine, because Ukrainians listen to our threats to make it a long war and just shake their heads and say, you don't understand. It'll be over fast. It will be a costless occupation. And you don't understand that because you're not really in the family. So your intelligence is wrong. You're getting Ukraine wrong. And that made it very difficult to deter Russia. So, okay, Ukraine has a different narrative. I'm much more partial to it. I think it relies less on false claims and disinformation. I think it is fair to treat it as a narrative, however, and I think it's fair to say that it's designed strategically, just like the Russian narrative is. It's designed with an eye to audiences outside Ukraine to make Ukraine as sympathetic as possible and provoke action in the West via the emotion of anger. So Roger Peterson is a scholar of emotion, and he defines indignation as anger provoked by the unjust treatment of another. So it's a system that requires three actors: an aggressor, and a victim, and an observer. In the current crisis, these roles are played by Russia, Ukraine, and the West, respectively. Russia is the imperial revisionist colonial aggressor. Russia attacked Ukraine, innocent victim, and the West observed and didn't do enough. Now, no matter what the West did, it didn't do enough. And that's how you know that this is about guilt. And it's not really about fear. That's something else that you can do, but not centrally. It's about anger and guilt. It's an indignation cycle. At least this is a picture of an indignation cycle. I could show you a fear story too. And I think that that's common, but I don't think that that's as central to the Ukrainian narrative as indignation. So it's clearly simpler It has fewer moving parts than the Russian narrative. And that's helpful, right? It has fewer things that are false and disputable, distracting, not central to the story. I'm married to a lawyer. My father-in-law is a lawyer too. I mean, sometimes when you're explaining, you're losing, right? Like if you just keep it really, really simple, this is a winning strategy for a lot of debate rounds. So I'm going to spend a lot of my talk today on this slide. I'll keep coming back to it. It is a bit of an eye chart, and I apologize for that. But it is an effort to parse the disinformation aspects of the Russian narrative. So what is disinformation? Colloquially, we would say fake news. It is a sustained, usually state-funded effort to plant false news stories in the minds of your adversary. A related operational term of art would be active measures, for those of you who are old school Cold Warriors and have long memories. So disinformation is a complement to propaganda, but it goes much further than telling a simple story to help your state's population understand a complicated event like a focal point. It's an investment in shaping the information space with lies, either to split your opponent's domestic political coalition or to sow battlefield confusion, or maybe some other purpose. We don't always know it when we see it. And so it actually requires an interpretive exercise. And I'm here today to provide a little bit of that interpretive exercise as a kind of a public service, as a kind of a public good, so that you know what you're hearing when you hear it. So when I'm teaching, and I know I'm going to have to play the part of a Russia understandist in order to explain the security dilemma or some other like related concept, I find it's useful to bring a bell to class so that I can ding myself, so that if I inadvertently sometimes say something and the students feel shy about interrupting me, they can ring a bell anonymously. And that's actually very helpful. So I have a bell on the table, and I invite Jim to ring it if at any point I say something that it's not clear what exactly I'm performing. But this table is set up to sandwich a meaty, ongoing empirical academic debate by those of us who work in the Ukraine space in between two thick bread slice rows of pure disinformation claims. So I'm going to try to perform for you this tightrope dance where I explain what the language of civil war did for the Russian position and why it was so useful to them. It was a language that in certain ways could only be harmful to the Ukrainian bargaining position. And that's why they were probably going to keep using it for the long haul prior to the current version of the war that we're in. So let's proceed methodically. So in the first row, Russia sends regular troops with their insignias removed in order to perform barely plausible kinds of deniability. So you have these pictures of Russian soldiers in Crimea on CNN in a split screen with Russian diplomats looking straight into the camera and saying, I have no idea who those people are. I think they might be Al-Qaeda terrorists. I hear those guys are everywhere, right? And that performance is meant to give Western leaders who don't want to go to war with Russia and don't want Article 2 to be the language, something that they can use to not look at as they, remind themselves that, well, Ukraine's not in NATO anyway, and so we don't have a treaty obligation to defend it. And calling it a civil war loads this into the conversation quite elegantly. It gives everyone a descriptive language other than invasion that would imply, different solution sets. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In a crude sense, you could call this just basic military deception, right? It's as old as written military history. It's all over Sun Tzu. And so it's not good for Ukrainians, of course, but it's perhaps not that analytically interesting. So I'm going to move on to the second row, which is distinct in its intent. And it's not about escalation management, not exactly. And it's not targeted at the same kinds of Western constituencies. To understand this, you need to get a bit into the weeds of how legal arguments can and sometimes do work at the United Nations around responsibility to protect. So the fabrication of human rights abuses and the claim that on Maidan and after Maidan, ethnic violence and even genocide between Western Ukrainians and Russians is imminent and right on the brink of breaking out. In fact, it's even perhaps ongoing. It's hard to tell. People have been saying all of that kind of stuff. The claim here is not that the Ukrainian right is full of nice guys. The claim is that there's just a big leap between what was actually going on in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine, in January, February, and March in 2014, and anything that you could possibly describe through the language of what was on Russian television about what was going on at the time. And that's because Russia wanted to telegraph to diverse audiences why it was about to do something like Kosovo. If Ukrainians are going to be analogous to Milosevic Serbs, then at some point, there actually has to be some story about a crucified innocent blonde Russian boy, or a gang raped Russian teenage girl, or mass graves that have just been uncovered, or whatever, whatever. They have to actually say that it's actually happening. Otherwise, it's not imminent. The Odessa fire is a very big moment in this disinformation campaign because with the Odessa fire, you finally actually had pictures, right? Video footage of an actual fire and people actually fleeing from it, which fit the narrative which they had been saying all along. But now there's actual video. And, for those of you who are thinking about the future, deep fake technology wasn't very good back then. And, we're moving towards a world where all of this stuff will be easier to manufacture. But in the world that we actually were in back in 2014, the Odessa fire ends up being a very important focal point here. Okay, why am I talking about all of this? And isn't this just the same thing as military disinformation? No, it's not. Russia is the member of the P5 of the UN Security Council that none of the other 4 members trust. But you do need all 5 to get a UN resolution through the Security Council. And if you want, for instance, to authorize a UN peacekeeping operation, then you need all 5. So Russia gets to cry crocodile tears for the victims of war, while also cloaking its own role in creating the circumstances that led to the violence. That would be another part of the book, another talk. I could talk about Maidan, but let's leave that out. They have a narrative that this whole war is kind of the fault of aggressive NATO expansion and the CIA coup. Okay, that's what they say. But that narrative doesn't get you to civil war automatically. They could have just made up other language. Civil war is useful because it comes with an implied solution, which is something like this. How about we, the P5 of the UN Security Council, how about we pull out a map and we check to see which of the 5 of us ought to send the soldiers to be the backbone of the UN PKO that's going to settle things in Ukraine. And concretely, my American diplomatic friends, if there were a civil war in Mexico with refugees streaming across the border and all those public bads, how many of you think that Americans would think it was okay to have a Chinese or Russian-led UN PKO on America's southern border? None of you? Good, neither do we. So in that context, let me tell you some first-person testimonials about Russian families threatened at gunpoint by Ukrainian fascists. So, that thing, is important to notice distinct from military deception, because that thing is about prepositioning arguments that will allow them to reverse engineer a settlement where Russia gets legal permission to stick around Ukraine forever, just like they stick around Georgia forever and stick around Tajikistan for a long time till they got exactly what they wanted in Tajikistan. I wrote a whole book about that. So Barnett and Duvall call this institutional power. And the point is that only the P5 are invited into this particular part of the conversation. If you're not one of the P5, the P5 are talking over your head about you. But that happens really all the time in Civil War studies. And so this is an example of using a language that invokes that. So it has to be said, it's a way of talking that is extremely effective at leaking into foreign affairs articles by way of the academic community in IR, because it goes over the domestic politics of every small country. And there are certain kinds of realists who like the power of making arguments in that way and calling it research. And that is just a thing that is a facet of American politics that the Russians completely understand. So now, moving off the eye chart for a minute and giving your eyes a break. The third row said, quote, the Maidan Revolution, whatever you want to call it, found much more social support in Western Ukraine than Eastern Ukraine, and it was violent, unquote. Okay, that's not fake news. It's just part of the Russian narrative, and it happens to be true. This is a map of count data of really, really big protests that were against Maidan, where large crowds really clearly bought the Russian narrative. We spend 100 or so pages of the book explaining why sometimes this energy turned into insurgency, but mostly it didn't. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't violence. And it doesn't mean that the energy wasn't mostly in the eastern part of the country. So in the Russian narrative, not in reality, but in the Russian narrative, these people who are protesting are the real Ukraine. They are the real Ukraine. And there's a small number of coup plotters and fascists and CIA-backed types who supported Maidan, and they need to be denazified. So if you want to understand like why the Putin war aim is denazification, like what is he talking about? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about restoring to power the people who are the real Ukraine in his mind. But this is where, according to their behaviors, and these are fairly costly behaviors. This isn't sending a tweet or filling out a survey. These are fairly costly behaviors. This is evidence of where there was some social sympathy for those behaviors. And it's not fake news. It's news. It's from your point of view, it may be unfortunate news, but it is a mistake to fight facts. Now, most of the action in our book takes place in the dark sections of the map. So we're interested in comparing kind of a social science design. The unit of analysis is the Russian-speaking community. And the question is when they're going to actually try to coordinate politically to activate their Russianness and actually opt out of the Ukrainian state, which is a big step further than just going out on the street and waving a Russian flag and saying you didn't like Maidan. Actually engaging in coordinated sedition doesn't really happen very often. It happens only in Crimea and in a couple of square blocks of Luhansk in a sustained way. Things get started in other places, but they don't stick around for very long. What happens is very chaotic, however, and it does give cover to this sort of thing. So in brief, in Crimea, the uprisings, the street uprisings gave cover to a clandestine Russian military operation that succeeds with a lot of local institutional assistance. So we all saw the Russian military intervention in near real time. I put that picture up before. It was on CNN, right? We all watched it. And with years to study the event and go into the details, what Dominique and I see is a not quite hostile takeover of the entire government and the decision by the bulk of the Ukrainian military stationed there to defect. And we document that in as detail as best we could. I don't want to whitewash the heroism of some extremely brave Tatars. However, if those Tatars had not actually interrupted the vote, we wouldn't know the little green men were there at all. And so that's just an important fact to remember in that moment. However, the Russian SOF did not face a very difficult operating environment in Ukraine. They would have faced a pretty difficult operating environment if they had gone anywhere outside of Crimea in force. There are attempts by people to seize government buildings. Sometimes they fly Russian flags. The flags are often violently taken down, and there's a lot of street violence. So this was a picture of the anti-Maidan protests. There's also pro-Maidan protests all over the country, except Crimea. Crimea is the one place where the pro-Maidan didn't really have much of a ground game, just the Tatars. But they weren't flying blue and yellow flags. They had different symbolism. So this is not a settled debate. This is the meaty debate in the sandwich that I was talking about before. I want to flag in particular the scholarship of Sergei Kudelia, who has a book contract with Oxford, and it's going to come out eventually. And when it comes out, you should read it because it's serious. He is very invested in the tipping game that takes place around Gherkin and the Strelkov group. And the question of how much of this is homegrown and how much of this is AstroTurf is very much a live debate, and our book is not the last word on it. Chris Miller of the Financial Times wrote a good book, which I taught last year. And he and Mike Kaufman were talking together, and they used the term clandestine invasion. I think that actually captures a lot. You know, Russia is acting like it's not there, and it's quite difficult to prove a negative. We don't want to claim like we've proved that Russia wasn't there. It's more a matter of emphasis, and that emphasis is important. But it is an ongoing debate, and it's tricky. I mean, look at this picture, and like really, I've left it up so you guys could all kind of get your heads around it. How many of you would bet anything valuable on the claim that there are no Russian agents in that picture? Okay. How many of you would bet anything valuable on the claim that they're all Russian agents in that picture? I don't know. I think it's tricky. We wouldn't say that all of those people are Russian agents. And that's our line in the book. We think there was a lot of local support from angry people who realized that the Party of Regions would never be able to give them what it had been promising to give them. And they were angry. So at the time, I tracked these behaviors on Twitter. And I'm pleased that the paper is something that you can read in the Journal of Post-Soviet Affairs. You can actually see the two narratives, these two different. This is all in the Russian language space, by the way. This is throwing away Ukrainian language tweets and English language tweets. Even in the Russian language, you can see the dignity narrative, keywords with word clouds, fighting against the Russian language keywords with word clouds. And you can see gradually over time, the dignity narrative, we call it the anti-Kremlin narrative in this visualization wins on the internet. Twitter becomes a pro-Western platform is another way to put it, just like, happens in many other events. But much less interesting than low-cost tweeting behaviors, which I think oftentimes political scientists look where the light is shining and we measure the thing that we have big data on because we imagine that that's going to be interesting to people. I think what's more interesting actually is sacrificing your life in a costly mobilization. So we're very proud of this map. I didn't put any Twitter data in the book, but I did put this data in the book. With the help of Ukrainian civil society, we coded the birthplaces of everyone who died on the Ukrainian front. And this is broken down by population. And I want to get a couple things from this map. The first is that you could think about it as a heat map of martyrs, most of whom probably died imagining they were fighting off a clandestine invasion. By the way, that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it would be a heat map of mourning Ukrainian parents, who still light candles every year, remembering their child who died fighting off an invasion or whatever. That's one thing about this. It's a very costly behavior. In other words, it's nothing like tweeting. Second, I think it's important to notice that it's not the East versus the West in any way, right? The Russian narrative of Eastern Ukraine at war with Western Ukraine. It's just, that's fake news. That's completely fake news. I put up a dotted line here around historical Novorossiya, just so that you can visualize the land claims being made by Putin's government in more or less real time. Their theory, their social theory of the case that this is the real Ukraine, is that those people would be firing west, right? But these are the people who are firing east. And it's, okay. I'm not going to give you any fancy econometrics. I just wanted you to sort of see the data. This is a picture that can be used to describe an entire country really pulling together and not pulling apart. And that is a better visualization of the outcome of the tipping game that we kind of describe in our book than any other one slide I could put up. And a tipping game sounds sort of abstract, it's like dominoes falling and all of these sort of game theory metaphors don't necessarily get it right. But our line in the book is that what Russia was describing on television at the time, describing April, May, June of 2014, this critical year, they described it as the Russian spring. And what it turned out to be was a Ukrainian spring. In the Russia, many of them are Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but that's a common thing. So I'm going to wrap up quickly and leave a lot of time for Q&A, I hope. But let me do the bottom 3 rows here. So Russian interventions at Ilovaisk and Debaltseve froze the territorial front line and conventionalized the war, which stopped civilian casualties, basically, between 2014 and 2022. Is this false? Well, it leaves out a lot. Did Russia save lives by sending troops at Ilovaisk and Debaltseve? This graph, this is off-the-shelf data. It's pretty high quality. The numbers are not rounded to the nearest 10. They end in single digits. It's from UN Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. It shows civilian and military deaths broken down in some reasonable ways. And after the battles of Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, civilian deaths basically flatten out. So yeah, probably, if you discount the rest of the context and define the issue extremely narrowly, freezing the conflict and conventionalizing the conflict probably did save some lives. Does that make it a humanitarian intervention? Not how I teach it in my humanitarian interventions class, but it's always a fun debate, right? I always get that one student who really likes to, play the part of the Russia understandist, and it's always fun to see where the conversation goes. Second to last row is the claim that Russian troops are not even in the Donbas, which is a persistent claim distinct from the chaos of the early war. It's interesting because it's so flagrantly false. From the downing of MH17 to the battles I just mentioned years afterwards, Russian diplomats continue paying lip service to respecting Ukrainian sovereignty and continuing to deny that they have any troops in Ukraine, even in an advisory capacity, and going so far as to constantly, in their diplomatic talking points, tell the West that the West needs to stay out of Ukraine and respect Ukrainian sovereignty. So this is why Steve Krasner calls sovereignty organized hypocrisy. Okay? It kind of looks like the first row, but it's important to note that it's referencing this ongoing period of bargaining that we now, we think about it as the Minsk period or the Minsk process. After the battles of Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, there were these ceasefire documents that were signed. There's a trilateral contact group. They eventually became reified with international involvement of various sorts. The OSCE was a central actor, but there was also a UN resolution. And the Ukrainian and Russian side accused the other of violating their Minsk Accord obligations all the time, and the ceasefire kept breaking down. The language is organized around three poles. If you go read the Minsk Accords for historical interest, they're really quite short. The three poles are ceasefire, something about autonomy, vaguely defined, and the remove of quote unquote illegal military formations, which is also not defined. And because neither Ukraine nor Russia can agree on the definition of either autonomy or what is an illegal military formation, and the ceasefire keeps breaking down, they just don't go anywhere. And so what happens is Ukraine adapts. Ukraine life goes on, and the Minsk Accords don't get implemented. And this is a heat map of Zelensky votes in 2019, right? Again, this is not a picture of a society pulling itself apart on an east-west axis. This is a picture of a society kind of pulling together, I would say. Now, Crimea is not voting. And during this period, according to Russian law and Russian interpretation of events, Crimea is part of Russia. The DNR, LNR are being held in limbo. And Russia's hope in the Minsk process is clearly to trade that population back into Ukraine. Crimea is not mentioned in the Minsk Accords, right? So if you got the toothpaste back in the tube in the Donbas, the quiet part is that there is no mechanism by which Crimea is ever discussed ever again. So that's one of the reasons that Ukrainians did not want to implement the Minsk Accords. But life still goes on. You have elections. We bring in a new person to replace Petro Poroshenko. He's in the pink. And you would think from this map that it was an overwhelming Zelensky victory, maybe perhaps analogous to the Saakashvili victory, that he just completely trounced his opponents. And that's not quite so. I mean, Petro Poroshenko's people, even though he lost pretty much the whole country, Petro Poroshenko's people in parliament continued to be quite powerful. They had a bloc in parliament organized around resistance to implementing the Minsk Accords that was organized, calling itself the, quote, no to capitulation front, unquote. And they had some arguments that I think it's really important that I give equal time to. I spent some time earlier in the talk performing some diplomacy on the part of a hypothetical Russian diplomat, and I want to give equal time to the no to capitulation front. The no to capitulation front argument would acknowledge that since Maidan, there have been some real fundamental changes to the social contract in Ukraine. And they would acknowledge, furthermore, that some of these behaviors are more popular in the West than in the East. And they would say, that's our right as a country that is on the front line against an invasion to respond as any nation on the front line of an invasion would. And if it is necessary for us to isolate, shrink, and reduce the political power of one portion of our society and magnify the political power of a different portion of our society, that's because it's our society. And we don't need anyone explaining to us that we don't have a right to do that. So, you saw that map of Zelensky votes. If these if these policies are so unpopular, let him and his coalition roll them back. The Kremlin is clearly giving moral permission to a lot of Ukrainian citizens to engage in sedition with their skewed narrative, which they will then use to reverse engineer some janky responsibility to protect narrative to invade us and steal our land, and then blame us for not being more, what's the right word here? Not being more pragmatic. That's probably the word that Western diplomats or Russian diplomats would use. And it's interesting that both sides accuse us of being the not pragmatic ones. That kind of performance was the kind of bread and butter of the no to capitulation front. And the policies that were passed during this period are many and varied, actually. And I think that at the end of the day, Ukraine certainly has a right to do all of this stuff, speaking as an American. But Russia calls this genocide. Is this genocide? No, of course not. Is any of that genocide? Of course not. The claim is offensive and it's false. It's not an offensive to it's not a justification to seize a land bridge with sham elections. But it is incredibly important to Ukrainians to end on that point. And it's also important to say that all of this complexity runs in the face of this narrative. And I think that that's a point that just needs to be acknowledged clearly by way of conclusion. We're at a moment where the Ukrainian narrative is as much about making Ukraine as sympathetic as possible. And pathos is actually hostile to complexity. This is a very fragile political moment. And I don't want to do anything that would damage the coalition that is resupplying Ukraine. But that puts social scientists in a difficult position because we don't want to be accused of putting our thumb on the scales and throwing away data. So the pathos piece is really critical here. And I'm going to end with a little bit of it, even though it's not my comparative advantage. One of the most sinister things about the Russian narrative is that it is a narrative in which Putin himself claims that he had no choice but to seize Crimea. That was forced on him by the behavior of Western actors. Evidence for that is essentially non-existent. It's certainly weak. And no one can tell the Tsar that. He's in an information bubble, and I think we know that. How do they use Crimea to justify territorial aggression? They say something like this. They say, look, after 8 years of stalled diplomacy, it's fine. It's time to just turn the page. The West is going to back Ukraine. That's fine. They sell weapons all over the planet. Why would we be surprised that they sell them to the Ukrainians? But we're going to get in there and we're going to defend our people, and you can't stop us. I think we probably can. I think we probably can, and we probably should. And I think that there are strong realist reasons for us to do that and to continue to do that. And Ukrainian suffering is purchasing something. It purchases something that is benefiting a lot of countries other than Ukraine. And from the point of view of these countries, including the United States, there's a really cold realist logic to making sure that Ukraine doesn't run out of ammunition. And I want to also end on a positive note, because I think that that's important for a talk like this. I think that essentially the dignity narrative, the Ukrainian narrative, has worked. I think it has worked because it's more true. I think it relies less on misinformation and disinformation, and so it's a more robust weapon in the information space. That's my personal belief. There is a pretty strong consensus around the world that Putin's Russia is behaving in a criminal manner. And one result of that is, I think, a pretty good consensus in my lifetime that is going to maintain through my lifetime that Russia will never be able to get into the clubs that Ukraine is now very well positioned to get into. And so that's the positive note, is that whatever happens in terms of the territorial front line, whatever its borders are, I think Ukraine is extremely well positioned to get into clubs that Russia can't get into. We shouldn't expect Russians to be happy about that, and we shouldn't expect them to stop being a machine that spouts disinformation. but at least now you can know a little bit more of it when you see it. So with that, we have, I think I left 45 minutes or so for Q&A. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of material there. So to discuss. So let's just start. Like, who has a question? Harold.
Great talk. For the folks online, Harold Trinkunis, Deputy Director here at CSAC. Can you tell us a little bit more about the audience for these narratives? And especially, the end, you end on the note that the dignity narrative has worked where in the world? And this recalls a conversation I think we had at Mike McFall's house over dinner one night where we talked about the rest of the world outside the West and how is that narrative playing out there? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. And the answer, obviously, if you want to think about the entire audience for a war that could go on for years or decades, the real answer is that the jury's out, right? In the global South, there are large populations that get their news from sources that are used to priming audiences that don't trust the benign intentions of the West. So you have pretty sympathetic audiences on Al Jazeera, and then there's populations in China, populations in India that might be more sympathetic to the Russian narrative. And who knows exactly what kids who are currently 7 years old are going to believe about this war when they're 17 or when they're 27. I mean, we have to, as social scientists, just admit we don't know. But there are two audiences for whom the Russian narrative doesn't work we can say with confidence, to not dodge your question completely, there's two audiences that the Russian narrative has not worked on at all. One is the median voter in most NATO countries. The other is Ukrainians. Political Russians within Ukraine, I think prior to the full-scale invasion, you could find pockets. Surveys suggest that you could find in some districts relatively large pockets of people who got their news from Russia and were sympathetic to the Russian story. And that would be impossible to squeeze out of survey data that you can do on Ukrainian populations today. You simply can't find political Russians the way we define it in our book in contemporary Ukraine. They have vanished. In the West, of course, things are more complicated. And I don't want to speak out of turn here about American politics, but it's been clearly central to the Russian military strategy that they split NATO, and they haven't. NATO is as unified as it's ever been and is expanding its membership. I like the talking point that Putin has created exactly the world he said he was afraid of. And that's, winning hearts and minds in the next generation of kids in Indonesia and Egypt is that's the long way around for Putin. Like, what he really wanted was to split Germany and France off, and he didn't. So I think that hits the spirit of your question. I think the United States is probably the weakest member of the NATO coalition at the present moment, but that's not news to anyone in this room.
I want to follow up in a way on that with, I guess, a question about. I mean, you said at the start you weren't going to get too much into the current or February 24th on, but that's what I kind of want to ask you about.
Yeah, I figured we'd get there in the Q&A.
Yeah,
I just wanted to signpost for people
right.
what the book isn't about.
So, but laying out what you've laid out, like how the Russian narrative is radically, or let's say a reasonable Putin or people around him would be updating a lot. That it's not really the case that there's like a narrow elite of fascists and like a giant body of people who just want to be in the Slavic family as they would like to visit it. So that it doesn't, I mean, a whole bunch of the maps you showed us suggest that that's gone, if it ever was there at all. So in terms of your, let's say, military and political strategy, it kind of leads you to say, like, okay, and you hear this from some of their public channels, okay, well, we'll just carry out the biggest genocidal project ever. We're going to just kill all these people. Like, what do you do faced with the evidence that no, this narrative is just like there are all these people, even Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who do not buy it at all, right? What are they? Even if you succeed on the
I don't
battlefield,
understand what the question is. I mean, I believe that's a beautifully stated actual statement of actual Russian policy.
Well, so the
Why don't
plan.
Russians rise up and
No,
replace their leader?
It's a question about Putin's and the leadership's thinking. We're going to win on the battlefield, and then what, right? And then we're going to occupy and kill everyone who, or it's going to be incredibly bloody after this because we have to just get rid of all these people who don't think right.
I think I want to be really careful how I answer here because I don't want to veer into spaces that are completely speculative or that I legally can't talk about. But let me try to answer your question head on. I think the early plan definitely was to do a light version of what you just described, kill a couple thousand, maybe 10,000 people, but that would be it because the Ukrainian state would fold immediately like a house of cards. And so it wouldn't be a costly occupation. And I have to say, Jim, I couldn't believe that they believed that because I had been studying Ukraine so closely and writing this book. And I had the arrogance to imagine that if I understood something about Ukraine, clearly the Russians understand this about Ukraine. And so the Russian military plan couldn't possibly be so foolish. They must be planning to do something really big, to do some shock and awe, turn off the lights, all of that kind of thing, then that would be their war plan. And it wasn't. We now know enough about what their operational assumptions were during the invasion to see that they really believed that. Now, at this
I understand that, but the question is now they shouldn't, right?
So why aren't they Bayesian updating?
Well, why aren't they saying okay, it can't be that the cost of their estimate of the cost of occupation, even if they're publicly, here's the narrative, has to have gone up a lot. I just understand what is the plan? It's got to be we're going to win some battles and then declare victory, right? I mean, I can't. It's hard for me to imagine they could actually want to carry through.
I
mean, maybe
I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm really not, Jim. And part of why I am hesitant to answer your question the way that my training by you would lend it is I could give you some performance tap dancing here saying, well, when you're in a bargaining game, you don't begin, by letting your opponents know what your ideal point is. You start with a maximalist thing to try to get them to meet you in the middle. And I could perform that for you. But when I watch Putin talking to Tucker Carlson and I see the things coming out of his mouth, I think that the plan might really be to just keep this war going as long as it takes. And if that sounds like genocide to the West, that's because the West doesn't understand just how much we want Ukraine. Does that sound like a head-on answer to your question?
It is an answer. It's very depressing, but it's.
I'm sorry. I'm depressed too.
Yeah.
I tried to end on a bright note, but it is depressing.
Catherine and then Jim.
Run off in a moment.
Nice to see you too.
So is it possible? I mean, it's sort of following up on Jim's question. It's impossible. Putin doesn't, I think, and probable. He doesn't think he's losing.
I think it's probable that he doesn't think he's losing.
Yes, it's probable that he doesn't, and in fact that he's winning, not because he hasn't succeeded. He doesn't. NATO. I think he's playing a game there to see whether it eventually could split, right? That it's not over yet, but it hasn't so far. So even there, he may not see that quite as a loss yet. And then internally, well, he just ran an election that went his way. He has as we understand it, he has a view of human nature that that society doesn't make its own. People don't make their own decisions. They're told and manipulated what to do. And so this has been true in Russia, and therefore it will be true in Ukraine. And so he can afford to wait and call whatever he wants a win in the end. People around him, the elites, are making money hand over fist, in terms of making armaments. China is still with him. India is still with him, or at least not against him.
Not against him.
And the global South, a lot of them increasingly are with him. So he doesn't see it as a loss yet, and he could take what he describes as Novorossiya, right? Everything south of Dnieper, and declare that a win for now, and come to a peace agreement, and unfortunately eventually come back. But he doesn't have to own all of Ukraine to have declared it a win. What's wrong with that narrative?
So if that's, I think I have a mic here. I think I'm probably okay. Yeah, but so I think, putting me on the spot in terms of what's wrong with that, maybe nothing, right? If that's a story of a Putin who's ready to deal, and of course the war restarts 10 years from now again, but for now, sure, yeah, but we understand this problem in the same way. But yeah, maybe he wants to deal now. Maybe that's it. So what's wrong with that? A couple things. I think it's pretty hard to sell what he has done as achieving any of Russia's fundamental war aims, for one thing. So if the fundamental war aims are regime change, denazification is really essentially regime change. That hasn't happened. Clearing Ukraine of Western influence, totally not happened. In fact, signed in the other direction. Ultimately, there's just a very big gap between what the Russian government says that its acceptable end states are, or even as a precondition for negotiations. They want Ukrainians to accept the territorial loss of the land bridge territories by way of the sham elections. The recognition that would be pragmatic, that it would be impossible for any Ukrainian leader to sit down at a table having agreed to that, is quite out of touch with the kind of rational defensive version of a calculator that you're thinking of. I mean, I don't think that he has enough domestic political support to do anything other than really crush the Ukraine that he has created with his story. Like, this is an example of the being used by the words that we use. In the Russian narrative, Ukraine is really dangerous. That Ukraine is an outpost for Western propaganda, that Ukraine is an infection vector for Western democracy promotion, which is obviously aimed at regime change in Russia. I mean, just once you really believe that this needs to be crushed, yes, of course, CSAC will call it genocide. We call it acting defensively against encroachment into our sphere of influence. And that's different than what you described, Catherine. I think that's different than what you described. So I'm not saying you're wrong. And who knows? Putin. We know Putin won't be there forever. We can start telling ourselves stories about a different government or something. But I'm trying to answer your question head on, and it's a real tough one.
So you're saying basically he has created this narrative in such hyperbole that he cannot act anymore.
And it might be worse than that. It might be that the person who comes after him will also be slave to the narrative, because you don't immediately admit that everything the guy before me did was crazy, or that the premises on which the guy before me did what he did were crazy. And so I'd like to have this be a complete first image story where you can just remove the Baron, and then House Harkonnen is gone. But I fear that that's not what's actually going to happen.
Jim Goldberg.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for this interesting talk, and I look forward to the book. And there were a lot of great things about the talk, including it was very clear about the different narratives. I'm interested in the people outside of the region who buy the Russian narrative, and particularly Republican members of the US Congress. I'm just curious, have you done any research on what is leading some of these people to actually buy into the Russian narrative? I mean, there are a bunch of different possible explanations, right? They could be getting paid off. They could just be useful idiots. It could just be a cynical political ploy. Maybe it's all of the above. But whether with respect to Republican members of Congress who are now being called out by some other Republican members of Congress, or others in the West, for example, who have you done any research on why those people are buying the Russian?
You know, I'd be lying if I said I had. You know, I have my own speculations, I think, like all of us do, but it's a difficult political space. As all of us know, the policymaking soup oftentimes requires bipartisanship. And so you don't want to alienate your political opponents. And I was pleased for a long time, I mean, up until just a few months ago, at the relative bipartisan cooperation on Ukraine. And the fact that that's broken down recently, I think, has more to do with structural factors than individual psychological factors. I mean, there's something about a weak Republican Party where Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually a veto player than what we had before. Where I think that saying much more than that is not responsible, because it's not politically useful to Ukraine. Because ultimately, I do want a lot of future Republicans voting for Ukraine, and I don't want to insult anybody. Other than Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Mike? Oh, no.
Hi, my name is Tatiana. I'm half Ukrainian, half Russian. Great research, straight to the point. Could you please explain that map of USSR?
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to move more quickly to Q&A. And so I also split my time today between giving 2 talks, and I did it by literally just dividing the deck at the very last minute. Sorry for not explaining what you were looking at. So this is a map from the Soviet Atlas of Ethnicities from 1989. This is the last good census that the Soviet Union performed before the institutional crack-up. And I use it to show that you can eyeball, you can eyeball the ethnic map serving as institutional templates for the new states that came into being. And earlier in the day, I used it to show that while ethnic Russians are in pink and Ukrainians are in orange, and you can kind of eyeball the ethnic Ukrainians are over there and the ethnic Russians are over here, but you can also eyeball certain tide pools. So Stephen Kotkin, I think he's at Hoover part-time. He's very good with memorable quips. And one of his great quips is that the Soviet Union broke up like a Hershey chocolate bar in neat little pieces. And if you look at Central Asia, you can see the Hershey chocolate bar actually pretty easily. David Layton upstairs has a different analogy, which is that when the Soviet Union broke up, it was actually like the tide receding at a rocky beach from the point of view of Russians, leaving little ecosystems, little funny tide pools of Russian language-speaking families who found themselves living in territory that they thought of as home, but was suddenly outside of the country that is supposedly their homeland. And so those, usually they're not in the majority. So usually they wouldn't be the majority on the census. Usually it's 30% of the territorial population. So it looks pink, you know, in areas where Russians are the majority. But you can see if this Wikipedia map weren't here, you would be able to see Crimea as a funny little tide pool. So what I've done finally is I took a map from Wikipedia just a couple of days ago where the color pink actually kind of lines up to show that what's actually happening is a territorial renegotiation of the de facto border of the pink. And I think that that's an attritional process at this point. I think Ukraine wants very badly to get back to its 1991 borders, and Russia wants very badly to re-break the chocolate bar because it wants to have more chocolate. And that's, again, that's pithy, and I'm stealing Steve Kotkin's memorable line, but maybe I'm not stealing it if I credit it. So that's what you were looking at. You're welcome.
It's fascinating to me how much this brings back memories of the 90s with the Russians in the role as the Serbs in Yugoslavia. And even territorially, it looks similar at a much larger scale. Yeah, Dean.
Now, this is a question that, probably there's no answer for, but what do you think, honestly, if you were going to speculate, what Russia would settle for? Basically the eastern third of Ukraine, or do you think they really want the whole country?
I think this regime would settle. I'm really just making stuff up here. So, I mean, with that caveat, I think this regime would settle for the North Shore of the Black Sea, including Odessa, so that you get a landlocked Ukraine that's not really economically viable for the next 300 years. And then it doesn't matter if Ukraine gets into the clubs that Russia will never be invited into, because it's really only ever going to be, second-rate non-Poland. And so I think that is a very brutal assessment of what their, let's say, medium-term aims are. In the short term, they might settle for what they have, but I believe the war will break back out again once they have more drones and more guys. I've become kind of a hawk on that position. But I'd like to think I was wrong about that. And so I think there's the final thing to say is that it might be that Russia, having seen how costly this is, and Russian leaders who aren't Putin eventually there might be some process of updating to say we just can't actually do much more than we already have. Ukraine's pretty tough to digest, sir, and they would hold with what they have. They might even trade some of it back, but I don't think they would trade back Crimea ever. I just don't think that they will ever trade back Crimea. They might trade back a lot of land in exchange for other things that they want that they can't get any other way. And now I'm just speculating again and making stuff up. But in terms of what they really want, I think that they really want Odessa. They sure seem to. I'm not trying to be flip. They sure seem to.
I've got one more question about 2022, but a striking difference between 2014 and 2022 is that in 2014, what your book is about, it's not hard to see. I mean, it's clear what there were triggering events. There was a trigger, right? And it's not hard to see why or how that plays into Putin acting. But in the escalation or further invasion of 2022, it's clear, or I think it's clear from the reporting that he's thinking he's going to do this in 2021 at some point.
Yep.
Having studied this period very intensely and the whole problem, what do you think? What led him to say, I'm done with Minsk and all that? Like, is it Zelensky comes to power and he thinks maybe that'll be better and it's not? Or like, what is it?
This is a good question. And Sam Sharap and I have talked about this at some length. Sam has a very particular meeting in mind that he attributes as the final piece of information. And I disagree with Sam on this. I think that it was closer to what you just said. I think that Putin decided to do this, some version of this, around the time that the essay on historical memory was published in 2019.
Which is like June or something.
He mentions in that, and it's Serhiy Plokhy who drew my attention to this because he's studied that text hermeneutically. He makes direct reference in that, which is clearly something he expects future history textbooks to reprint. This is like his manifesto of what his legacy will be. He references Ukrainian leaders getting elected on one platform and then doing something else once they're in. And so that has to be a reference to the fact that they thought that they were going to get in Zelensky, in this comedian from the East, someone who was going to fulfill his campaign promise, made tongue-in-cheek, of course, to go to Putin on his hands and knees and get the territories back. Once Zelensky comes in, he essentially falls in line with the no to capitulation front position and does not do that. And there are a number of really good Zelensky biographies out there that explain Zelensky in far more detail than Putin's caricature of this guy who I want to come over here and bow and scrape before me. But I think when Putin got his head around the idea that even when someone in the East who isn't Poroshenko wins, we still are not going to get anything like what we think we deserve, that's when he defaulted to, I'm going to break Ukraine. But the exact month that that happened or the exact year that that happened, I think is harder to get my head around. But I think that was the jump. I don't think that it was anything particular. I definitely, Mike McFall has departed. I agree with Mike that it's not any one thing that that NATO did, in the lead up. There isn't like a triggering event there. It's more like everything in the world that Putin in 2001 was optimistic about had, let him down about the West, and that manifests in a desire to actually annihilate Ukraine rather than let the West continue to influence Ukraine.
Very helpful. Ori?
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask you about the impact of the US decision to disclose intelligence prior to February 22.
Yes.
And did that have any kind of impact, as far as you can tell us, on Putin's decision making?
Yeah, I think it probably did. But at that point, the decision making was not, am I going to invade or not? I think at that point, it probably changed some things operationally, because it showed that we the West really didn't mind sending the costliest signals that we could send to let them know that we had been reading their emails for a long time and really knew exactly what they were about to do. And we going public in that way was, this is not what intelligence is for. But it was a kind of a costly signal for us to be able to communicate with them. Listen, we can call your shot. Here's what you're gonna do. And Blinken said some things on hot mics that very much had that feel to him. And I think Blinken saying those things that he said probably changed a little bit about how day zero went down, because they knew, yeah, exactly, tactics. But it's not in the spirit of Jim's question, which is, oh, now that the U.S. has gone public with the intel, now we have to invade. Just no way. No, that's not how any of it works in my thinking. More than that requires psychological assessments of Putin at a level of granularity I don't know. I mean, some people will say he sized Biden up when they met earlier and he decided this is someone I can push around. I mean, what? Maybe, but I doubt it. I think he probably decided way before he met Biden. I do think that I do think that this would have all been different if there had been a Trump presidency. I think the whole world would look really, really different. But again, speculation, and I don't want to offend my political adversaries across the aisle, because we need bipartisanship in order to actually do resupply. It's very tempting. It's extremely tempting to throw red meat to the dark web in this space, but it's not responsible.
Harold.
Great. I'm going to follow up. I think the response to one of Jim's questions, and back to this audience, we've talked about sort of Ukraine, we've talked about the West, we've talked about the global South. What about sort of Russia as the audience, and the role in which, is the messaging essentially consistent? Is it somewhat different? And what role does it play into managing the costs of the war? Because I'm thinking back to the Soviet period and this narrative of, maybe tens of thousands of casualties in Afghanistan, 20, 30,000, leads to the formation of like mothers groups and like a, sort of like a protests against the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. It's like, is that sort of Putin has figured out that this is a problem, therefore he's managing it with this messaging? Or is there another explanation for why what presumably are like 10 times as many casualties is not producing that kind of political effect? Well, I understand there's a minorities argument about where they're drawing their recruits from, but anyway,
yeah, I've been doing some research on where the recruits are drawn from, and I'm thinking about that seriously. I'd make two points on this as someone who's not an expert on Russian domestic politics, and I'm speaking, at arm's length from that community. I could direct you to some really high quality researchers if you want offline. But two points. The first is that I think that the repressive capability of the Russian state and its demonstrated willingness to just throw anyone in jail who is anti-war, or even one degree of separation from anti-war, just to make an example out of people, is stifling. And anybody who has read even a little bit of the literature on Soviet behaviors, Timur Kuran's synthesis is a fine place to start. Preference falsification is real, and people are living in fear of saying or performing the wrong thing. So even if the costs are serious, you don't have a social contract that allows for the creation of civil society groups like similar to the ones that you were talking about in Soviet times with Afghanistan. Although, in a long war, who knows what will happen, and I can caveat that. But right now, the society seems pretty locked down. The second is that I think it's important to remember this is a society that has actually been prepared for this with World War II propaganda and a lot of echo chamber narrative for years prior to the war. Like, they knew what they were supposed to believe about Ukraine well before the invasion of Ukraine. And the way that the 24-hour news cycle works with the Russian disinformation bubble is very, it allows for a lot of spontaneous creativity and improvisation. I mean, you can think about the narrative that I put up before as sort of, a jazz chord progression that invites any saxophonist to stand up and do their little bit. That's a lot of what is created in an ecosystem that the Kremlin doesn't have to actually micromanage. Like, they give you the chord progression, and you go to jail if you play a different song. And then the chord progression allows actually competition in the 24-hour news cycle in Russian language as different talking heads try to working towards the leader. I mean, the leader, yeah. There have been some really high quality descriptive studies of just how weird this is. If you don't speak Russian and you don't pay attention to what's on Russian television, you would find it downright bizarre. But they outrace each other, and it's not necessarily seeking the leader; it's seeking ratings to out crazy each other. It's the same sort of thing that you see in certain far right ecosystems in the United States media apparatus, but it's completely unconstrained with any tie to reality. And eventually the body bags are going to create that tie to reality. But that's new. Like, between 2015 and 2022, there weren't enough body bags in the trickle of people coming back dead from the DNR LNR that they ever had to update their narrative. And so there's at least 7 years of the picture that I put up before, that I started with, of the West, the cynical, evil West that has brainwashed a small number of Ukrainian elites, is really at fault for this. And we understand that we're the good guys. We are the ethical good guys, and we are the only ones in this entire conversation who are not hypocrites. Everyone wants to believe that about themselves, and Russians were given a lot of evidence consistent with the idea that that's true. A lot of propaganda, but also a lot of evidence that other people of authority on television anyway believed that it was true too. And again, that has a lot of resonance with the media studies of information ecosystems in the United States. So did that answer your question in the spirit you asked it? Yeah. It's a very hard problem to think about how to solve from the outside, I have to say. But it's part of why Russia is so threatened, or why some Russians are so threatened by a cosmopolitan Ukraine where a lot of people speak Russian and are inoculated against the Russian narrative, because that then does become a platform for fire alarming, the worst excesses of Russian disinformation in Russian in real time. So I think that's a reason to be threatened if you have a certain worldview.
All right. Well, that's great. I mean, that was extremely insightful talk and discussion. Thank you very much, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.